And so here we have an armed guard on top of a water tank. Oftentimes, societies behave this way. There is ignorance of the problem, there is alarm, and there is overreaction. There's also some of this that takes place. We have scientists. Can I call you back? We're in the middle of transitioning from spinach allergy research to water security studies. The suggestion here, as the doctor mentioned in previous panel, is that sometimes we forget who's leading and who's following. Sometimes opportunities arise for science then to say, this will fit in what I do, or this is research that's necessary. But instead of preceding the problem, we have a reactive scientific community. It's not a problem. It is what it is. Remember, we're going to be talking here about effectively communicating the threat. Now, oftentimes you have people who say, gee, if I can write a contrarian book, if I can write a book that says it's not a problem, if I can author something that says all of this is nonsense, then I probably will sell a lot of books because people want to be told it's going to be okay. There is no threat. And so books like Overblown, False Alarm, and many others are there. Again, my topic is, are we effectively communicating the threat? One could argue the other side is effectively communicating the anti-threat. Now, as I began to do some research in preparation for our discussion this afternoon, I discovered a lot of material, some of which I want to share with you, to make the point about what are we looking for if we're going to judge ourselves effective. Some time ago, the Denver authorities around their water supply reservoir decided to close the access road. And for those who have been in Colorado, and I come from Colorado Springs, you know that access roads around reservoirs give you immediate access to the water. Denver decided to close it. For political purposes, again, the doctor mentioned earlier about politicians making these policy decisions. So local politicians thought it would be a nice opportunity to talk about how distracted we are to now have to drive around the reservoir. And so the attention then moves from the real risk to Denver's water supply to my being inexperienced or my being somehow inconvenienced about how it is that I can travel. Alarmism, often using nonsense to misinform, is another communication effort that must be countered, that must be thwarted. This idea of toilet to tap, taking those two terms, visualizing them, and then presenting those to the unwitting public. The little boy, this is what you're going to be doing if you listen to these environmental extremists. And clearly, a very, very human nature is to deny. It's not a problem. I got excited, we overreacted. At the end of the day, it really isn't there to worry. And as I did some research, I simply captured a number of headlines, bylines, article titles, to give you a sense of the number and the proliferation of articles that simply say, this simply does not occur. And there's clearly this environmentalist have a peculiar view of the earth. So there is a backlash, there is a pushback, and I'm sure you're aware of it. Again, we're talking to people who get it. We're talking to people who understand there is a threat. Now, for my own community in academia, you often have very scholarly work that's done to disprove or to minimize risk and threat. And this can be very, very daunting, where you have scientists who provide a very scholarly, researched, convincing argument and publish in scholarly journals such as this. But as I did some research, I ran into a very intriguing article, title of which, "Why Aren't Americans Head or Heels Over Our Environment?" The author, Terry Laporte, and there's a URL there at the top. And what I want to do is walk through the 4 or 5 points that she makes, because I think they're very profound, and I think they apply to more than just the United States. That in the face of economic crisis, this is written now in the latter part of 2008, foreclosures, Afghanistan, Iraq, attention simply isn't there. And she goes on to say that many people like to believe, you know, if left alone, it will simply take care of itself. And she makes a pretty convincing argument that maybe the best thing to do is nothing. And many Americans, I like that. That means I don't have to really do anything more. The too much money argument. And you've got the statistics there in front of you. As all of my colleagues this morning talked to you about, we must do this, we need to do this, we ought to do this. If you put dollars and cents against all of those, we need to, we must, we ought to, it gets very, very expensive. And so in a world, in a reality of resource scarcity, this becomes a very powerful problem. This was very intriguing. The doom and gloom fatigue. Enough already. Enough already. I can't take any more of this. How many more messages of, oh my God, can I deal with? My friend from Israel knows what I'm talking about. Many Israelis suffer from this idea of, it is just I am now numb. And this is the final one that I want to share with you because I think it particularly relates to this audience. It is simply too hard to understand. This is not simple stuff. And when Americans look for simple answers and don't find them, then it becomes hard for them to get their heads around it. Here is the takeaway. And if there's anything that I would urge you to think about as it relates to effective communication, it's this observation. The scientific community, many of you, are not journalists and you are not politicians. But yet journalists and politicians and writers and academics do know how to communicate very effectively. Orally and in writing. Do scientists? No. This is the argument that this lady makes. And so to understand how can we in this scientific community become much more effective in communicating the threat, we need to look inward and look at our ability. We want to believe as scientists. The science is self-evident. There it is. To date, one could argue it hasn't worked. Again, the message of my brief this afternoon.